The English Civil Wars were a series of three distinct armed conflicts that took place between 1642 and 1651. These wars were fought between supporters of the English crown on one side and the supporters of the English Parliament on the other side. The first major battle of the First Civil War took place at Edge Hill in October of 1642, and the war continued until the surrender of King Charles I in May of 1646. Fighting between the two sides was renewed in April of 1648, but the Second Civil War was a short one, ending in September of the same year. The Third Civil War began the following year in 1649 and lasted until the final defeat of the Royalist army at the Battle of Worcester in September of 1651. Around 180,000 English people died as a result of these wars. This number represents a whopping 3.6% of the total English population at the time and includes soldiers as well as non-combatants. The number of total casualties is even higher when deaths from fighting in Scotland and Ireland are included. In this video we are going to discuss the causes and origins of these wars. The parliamentarians who waged war with King Charles I were primarily concerned with two issues. Firstly, Parliament felt that the king was abusing his power and that his actions and policies represented a threat to the rights of the English people. Parliament's many complaints against the king were outlined in November of 1641 when the House of Commons passed the Grand Remonstrance. The second issue contributing to the civil wars was religion. The two sides, royalists and parliamentarians, clashed over details of the Protestant faith and disagreed on how the church should be governed. The supporters of the king were mostly members of the Church of England, which was the dominant religious authority in England in the years leading up to the civil wars. These Anglicans, as we'll call them, believed that the church should be ruled from the top, governed by the monarch with the help of his bishops. It was this hierarchical structure that was so offensive to the king's enemies. The parliamentarians were mainly followers of Puritanism. In contrast to the Anglicans, the Puritans believed that the church's authority did not come from the crown, but was derived from the worshippers at the local level. This way of thinking was more in line with mainstream Protestant Calvinists in continental Europe. Meanwhile, the Anglican scheme of church governance was more in line with the Catholic way of thinking. The Parliament at this time in England's history was not a permanent outfit. Parliaments convened only when the Crown called on them, and the monarch could send the members away at any time. When parliaments were in session they dealt with issues such as taxation and legislation. Parliaments were composed of two chambers, an upper chamber, known as the House of Lords, and a lower chamber, called the House of Commons. The members of the House of Commons were there to represent the people, and these members were selected by committee or through local elections. It was a common practice for an English monarch to summon Parliament and use it as political cover to get what the Crown wanted. Usually what the Crown wanted was more money. Revenue was raised through taxation, and, unsurprisingly, taxes were as unpopular in the 17th century as they are nowadays. A monarch that decided to levy taxes unilaterally was viewed as a tyrant and risked a fierce backlash. So instead the Crown would call Parliament and seek to gain the consent of the two chambers to raise revenue. When this tactic succeeded it added an element of legitimacy to the issue of taxation, and it helped English monarchs avoid unrest among the people. In the event that the Crown could not gain the consent of Parliament to levy a tax, creative measures were sometimes used to raise money. For example, Charles I forced his subjects to give him a loan, which nobody expected him to actually pay back. King Charles I became king in March of 1625 and summoned Parliament on 3 separate occasions during his first 4 years on the throne. However, The members were reluctant to give him the revenue he wanted, and the frustrated king made threats that he would circumvent Parliament and act unilaterally if his demands were not met. Parliament responded in 1628 by drafting the Petition of Right. The petition placed restrictions on the king's powers, including a prohibition on any taxation unapproved by Parliament. The petition passed both houses of Parliament, and in June of 1628 Charles grudgingly accepted the petition in the face of mounting pressure. The king's acceptance of the petition was cause for celebration, but there were still lingering concerns about the king abusing his power and violating the rights of his subjects. The next session of Parliament began the following year in January, and lasted until March, when Charles called for the Parliament to be dissolved. However, some members ignored the king's orders and refused to be dismissed. In an act of extreme defiance, these rogue members held hostage the Speaker of the House of Commons, and they voted for a resolution that condemned anyone helping Charles sidestep Parliament's authority. This resolution angered the king, and when he had at last succeeded in dissolving the Parliament, he had the leaders of this rogue group arrested. Charles would not call another Parliament for 11 years. There was one other noteworthy resolution passed by this Parliament in 1629 before it was dissolved. This resolution condemned anyone who supported and promoted what the members of Parliament called popery, as well as Arminianism. This resolution reveals a lot about how Parliament viewed religion, and how the members tended to favor Puritan beliefs. They considered the ideas of the Pope, and the ideas of Dutch religious leader Jacobus Arminius, to be incompatible with the true and orthodox Church. Suspicion of Catholics in general, and the Pope in particular, was widespread among the English people, and it was something that both Puritans and Anglicans could agree on. Neither group wanted to see popery, or the influence of the Catholic Church, spread and strengthen in England. But Puritans and Anglicans did not see eye to eye on the threat of Arminianism the way they did on popery. Arminians rejected the religious concept of predestination, which was so important to Puritans. And Arminians were not quite so hostile to the Catholic Church. This was enough for Puritans to view Arminians as supporters of the Pope. Meanwhile, Anglicans had much less of an issue with Arminians. Charles supported Arminians and gave them high-ranking positions in the church. In return, the Arminians were loyal to Charles and supported his policies and his struggle to get what he wanted from Parliament. Puritans, Anglicans, and Arminians were not the only major religious groups in England at this time. There were still many English Catholics, and they mostly supported Charles. It was their way of avoiding persecution and gaining the king's protection against the Protestant majority that feared and hated them. Charles, of course, was not Catholic, but his French wife, Henrietta Maria, was Catholic. The king and his Catholic queen were close. Charles allowed Catholics at his royal court, and the queen was permitted to hold mass in her chapel. Despite the king's public acceptance of the Petition of Right, and its prohibition on non-parliamentary taxation, Charles found ways to raise money during the 1630s. He did this with fines and taxes, and he did it without seeking Parliament's approval. Charles levied a ship money tax in 1634. This tax was meant to raise money for the building of warships, ostensibly for the purpose of protecting the nation. At first the tax was collected only from coastal regions, but by 1636 it had been extended to the whole country. The king attempted to justify the ship money tax the same way he had justified his forced loan from the previous decade. Charles reasoned that the crown had the power to impose a tax during times of emergency. The problem was that there was no real emergency at this time. However, There was nothing that the king's critics could do to stop the king from declaring an emergency anyway. Despite the discontent that it created, the ship money tax was successful in raising revenue for the crown, and it helped to alleviate the crown's financial problems, but only for a short time. In 1640 Charles ran into financial difficulties again, and in April he felt that he had no choice but to finally call another parliament to help him get more money. Charles was running short on funds because he had spent money raising an army and sending it into his other kingdom to the north, Scotland. The Scots were protesting the use of a new prayer book that Charles had forced on them in 1637. Understandably, the Scots wanted to worship in their own way, and so they were ready to go to war with the king over this very important issue. The king's attempt to get the Scots to submit by force did not go well for him, and the new parliament wasn't much help in providing the funding that he needed to continue the military campaign. Charles gave up on the new parliament and dissolved it after only 3 weeks. This parliament is now known as the Short Parliament. Things got a lot worse for Charles a few months later in August of 1640 when the Scottish army marched into England and captured New Bern. Now the king was short on money and losing control of his kingdoms. In desperation he made peace with the Scots and gave up on enforcing his prayer book in Scotland. But the Scottish soldiers did not go home immediately, and the king was forced to pay the expenses of the Scottish army while it continued to occupy northern England. With this new financial burden to bear, along with the rapid weakening of his power, Charles once again summoned Parliament for help in November of 1640. This new Parliament, now known as the Long Parliament, would end up staying in place for the next 13 years.